Taxi!
Where to, mate?
Hello, mate. 55 Tufton Street, please.
55 Tufton Street, SW1. Yep, I know it well. Hop in, sir. This is A Nation of Taxpayers, a weekly podcast from the Taxpayers Alliance.
On this episode of A Nation of Taxpayers with me, Duncan Barks, in the Taxpayers Alliance studio this week, we welcome back Elliot Keck from the TPA. Good to see you.
Hello, Duncan.
And our special guest this week is Mark Littlewood, Director at Popular Conservatism. Welcome.
Great to be with you.
And thank you very much for coming in. Your legend makes great reading, and there's a lot of stuff here to kind of pick over. I think a lot of our listeners will know you're a former director at the Institute for Economic Affairs, and also, and I'm fascinated by this, former Chief Press Spokesman for the Liberal Democrats. So you could almost argue you've had quite an interesting journey. Should we talk about your journey from then to where you find yourself now?
Yeah, you're right, Duncan. It's quite a crime sheet, isn't it, really? I've probably got other offences to be taken into consideration as
Southampton
well.
FC fan?
Yeah, all sorts of offences to be taken into consideration. Yeah, I mean, I think on the face of it, you would say that, you know, I must have had some massive road to Damascus experience at some point, or indeed several of them. Been a bit more boring and gradualistic than that, really. I mean, I've always considered myself a kind of classical liberal. I think the state should basically keep out of both your wallet and your bedroom. And I've been fairly consistent in that regard. I've never sort of really found comfort in any single political party that I think has been consistent and represented those sort of values. One area where I did change my mind was on the European Union.
Yeah.
I used to be you didn't mention in my crime sheet that my first job was working for the European movement.
Right.
And I became a pretty staunch Brexiteer by the time of the referendum. So I have changed my mind on a few things, but I'm a little bit of the view that when the facts change, I change my mind. On the EU, for example, I can imagine a universe in which there is some sort of European economic community that free market liberals would welcome. One sort of mutual recognition of qualifications, for example, smashing down trade barriers, ripping back protectionist nationalist regulation. So it's not really the concept that completely horrifies me. It's how it started to operate.
Yeah.
And essentially, although it looks like I've drifted to the right over the last 10 or 15 years, and I have to some degree, let's be honest, the world has drifted massively to the left, right? So when I was at the Liberal Democrats and Ming Campbell, God rest his soul, was leader, the Liberal Democrats supported a top tax rate of 40p, not the 45p that exists today, which would now put you on the kind of radical free market right of politics. So yeah, hands up, I have changed my mind on a number of things. I don't regret that. I'm open to changing my mind again.
Yeah.
But I think that I haven't changed my mind quite as much as the world has changed its position.
Let's talk about Brexit for a second, because it's back in the headlines because we're learning slowly that Rachel Reeves is going to start blaming the state of the economy on Brexit. So she's going to wind the clock back 10 years. And there's a narrative developing that this is going to be her attack point against the Tories and also Reform UK. So let's just spend a few moments revisiting Brexit. Was there for you one trigger where you started thinking, actually, because you lay out the stall really well there, you know, this idea of trading partners, blah, blah, blah. Was there one particular instant, one trigger where you thought, actually, no, I think this is wrong now?
No, it was a litany of things.
Right.
So it seemed to me that the EU was involved in complete trivia, really. You know, the maximum suction power of a vacuum cleaner, the exact wording of a warning on a packet of cigarettes, that kind of thing. And it therefore had a kind of addiction, an absolute addiction to total regulatory conformity rather than a mission for general deregulation. I do remember a moment, it took quite a long time for it to percolate through my mind. The very first time I visited the European Parliament, which must have been, I want to say 2006, somewhere around there. And I can't put my finger on it. There wasn't a particular debate or decision that was happening that day that made me think. It was just the whole nature of the place was this sort of Kafkaesque aircraft hangar, which was sort of very celebratory about itself. I can remember when I went there, it was colon cancer awareness week, and they had a giant inflatable where you could literally disappear up, well, not your own backside, but an imaginary giant backside. And I thought that summed up the European Parliament really pretty well. So, and then I suppose when I became embedded at the IEA, I became more and more attentive to how bad regulations harm economic growth. And it struck me that the European Union was the provider of a lot of those. And I think there's a very perfectly sincere and cogent case that can be made for Remain. I don't think that people who are in favour of Remain are mad, but it seemed to me quite convincingly on the balance that leave was the better answer. Whether we've done enough with the Brexit powers we've got, I'm highly critical of. But the good news is that those powers are still on the table, even if we haven't pulled any of the levers that we should have done yet.
I think one of the issues that liberals and people on the sort of liberal side of the political ledger, and I don't mean the American form of liberalism, I mean the classical liberalism you've mentioned, is that liberalism has come into conflict with democracy and bureaucracy over the last few decades in a way that means that what would otherwise be very liberal principles end up in the long term sort of degenerating. And the EU is a great example of that. It's sort of an organisation founded basically on liberal principles of free trade within European economies. Actually, the result of that was you ended up creating a new bureaucracy, and what bureaucracies do is they end up finding ways to increase their power, increase their strength, increase their level of influence and control, and that's just the nature of bureaucracy. And as a result, I think a lot of liberals came to the conclusion that the only way to get around that problem is to abolish the bureaucracy entirely. And then I think the other issue is the issue of democracy, which is that the public and the electorate generally are always going to support government doing more, government spending programs. It's very rare to find the public support a cut to spending unless it's spending on a particular group that the public feel a distinct lack of sympathy with. The only really obvious one there is probably foreign aid. And that sort of brings us on to another issue, which is a bit like the EU with a lot of liberals, which is that of immigration. And you know, the sort of really sort of classical liberal small state argument for why you can have open borders is that essentially if you don't have a welfare state, then the only incentive to come to the United Kingdom would be if you genuinely have a sufficiently high paying job that you're able to contribute to the economy. And that works quite well. However, the problem is if you go to the electorate and your programme is, guys, we can have open borders, we just have to entirely abolish the welfare state, you'd get, 5 to 10 votes out of the 40 million 30 million people in the electorate. And so I think liberalism does have this issue that you have this very noble set of principles that standing on their own work very, very well, but then they come into conflict with bureaucracy and democracy, and it's about finding ways to support liberal values and principles in a way that don't end up just
Well, on immigration, I wonder if, let me run this up the flagpole and see if anyone salutes. I actually think you can reconcile kind of classical liberal market principles and a tighter immigration policy than open borders. I have changed my mind that, if you like, the default setting for a classical liberal should be open borders. I mean, you're obviously right, Elliot, you'd have to unravel the welfare state. Wasn't it Milton Friedman who said you can have open borders or a welfare state, but not both? But I'm not sure I want either in their present form. So I mean, this meme that sort of kicked off a little bit that Kemi Badenoch's pioneered and others, that we're a family. It's not a hotel. It's a home. Yeah. And I think that's about right. We should think of the UK as a club, and it has doors and it has a membership fee, and you could reconcile that with the welfare state, right? And although it's a slightly pompous way of looking at it, I sometimes use the analogy of a club I'm a member of in Pall Mall. I'm a member of the Reform Club. And I pay an annual membership fee to be a member, which is somewhere in the region of £2,000 a year, which roughly speaking is the running cost of the club divided by the members. It's not quite as simple as that, but it's basically that. Well, the UK, I think government expenditure divided by the population is about £18,000 a year.
Yeah,
so that should be the membership fee. Yeah. You pay that on the 1st of January each year. Yeah. If you want to come over and study underwater basket weaving at Lancaster University with your wife and 6 children, that is 8 of you at £18,000 a year. You pay up front. And there are also a set of rules at the Reform Club which go beyond just paying the membership fee. Yeah. that gets a bit more nebulous. But you've got to dress in
You're
a certain.
advocating people have to wear ties.
Well, no longer, sadly, no longer. But you do have to wear a collared shirt. You're not allowed to use a mobile phone. You can't be
and
abusive to the
translate
staff.
that into it'd be nice if you actually respected the laws in this country.
Yes,
right?
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So it doesn't seem to me obvious that a kind of classical liberal couldn't see, in economic terms, the UK as a club, and there's a means of applying, and there's a cost of membership, and there's a code of conduct if you enjoy it, if you wish to join it. The Reform Club you wouldn't say is anti-free market because it doesn't have an open borders policy, right? If you wandered in, or if you fell over on the steps of the Reform Club and you were not a member of it, I dare say the Reform Club would usher you in, probably give you on the house a stiff whiskey, probably give you a napkin or a serviette to mop up any blood. We would then send you on your way. Yeah. You would not be given a room upstairs for 18 months while we processed your membership application, right?
It's a good analogy. I mean, let's get your sense, and we'll get on to Popular Conservatism, PopCons, in a few moments' time because it was set up in February 2024. But let's just go through how you view our current political landscape. Because when I went and got you earlier, I said, how's it going? You said 7 out of 10. I said, 7 is not particularly high rating. And you went, well, look at the state of the country. So let's just break that down in more detail. Give us your brutal assessment of Sir Keir Starmer's Labour government so far.
It's a little bit like the mythical story of what every ambassador from a major country in Italy would report back if they were asked, what is the situation in Italy? At any point between 1950 and 2000, they would say that the situation is disastrous but not serious, and that's sort of I think that's sort of where the UK is now. The position is absolutely disastrous. We have utterly unsustainable public finances that no mainstream party seems willing to seriously address. The Conservatives sort of make a nod in that direction. So there is not necessarily a conspiracy, but a kind of a subconscious joint enterprise in not facing up to that reality. Social cohesion and trust in our institutions is breaking down, possibly even shattering. It is extremely hard to see how things don't get a lot worse before they get better. That would be my rough audit of it. And that there might be amongst the public, to some degree, but amongst the political elite, we are miles away from there obviously being an appetite to tackle the challenges that need to be tackled. And that worries me quite a lot. So I think we will probably limp on in a rather injured and dilapidated state for a while before there's big change. And that's rather disappointing. So I think my 7 out of 10, I might actually, having thought about it, knock it back to a 6 out of 10.
Yeah, I mean, the public finances data out today was pretty horrifying. Highest level of borrowing since 2020, which of course was a COVID year. The current Labour government is getting to wartime levels of borrowing. The level of debt interest has continued to climb as well, and they're not receiving anywhere near as much tax as they were expecting, which only goes to demonstrate that if their answer to that fiscal black hole is more tax rises, it will fail on its own merits.
And that is their answer.
We do appear to, having had this multi-year experiment with the Laffer curve to test exactly where it is, we definitely seem to now be well past it. And in some taxes, we've been well past it for a number of years, but I think we're actually getting close to the point of the Laffer curve on the sort of national account as well.
You said something quite interesting when you were giving your assessment. We talk about fiscal responsibility, and I can't quote you word for word, but this idea that the Tories kind of like nod in the right direction. Do you genuinely? Well, no, actually, I'll re-ask the question. I'm not just about the Tories. Do you think that there is a political party currently, the one fully grasps the financial challenges we have coming down the tracks or already here, and two, have the backbone to actually provide a solution?
Not obviously, I would say. You might look at Reform UK and think that some of their instincts seem to be in this direction, and I would concur with that, in that I think Farage at the leading lights of Reform UK, but also the grassroots, sort of start from the point of view that the country's completely broken.
Yeah.
Not just that it sort of needs a bit of a tinker here and a bit of a tinker there, and if only we could change this particular policy, but that something has gone fundamentally wrong. So I think they've got the psychological mindset potentially to grasp it. The Conservatives have rather more specificity at the moment on how they would tackle it. And example, Kemi Badenoch saying we're going to get rid of 1/3 of the civil service. But that just takes us back to 2016 levels. Yeah. I mean, it's hardly an unbelievably awesome and radical plan. So my worry at the moment is Reform UK have got sort of in their guts have worked out that.
So they got the instinct.
Yeah, but not yet in their mind.
Yeah.
And the Conservatives are sort of indicating the kind of keyhole surgery that they might engage with if they were to return to office, but still seem to give the impression that they basically want to keep the show on the road as is. And it's just to keep the show on the road, unfortunately, we're going to have to get rid of the drummer and the bass guitarist and a couple of the lighting directors. But basically the show will go on. Yeah. Once we've made those trims. And I think I'm much more radical on that. I think the show can't go on. I think we need a completely different show.
Yeah, and the elephant in the room, as you and I have talked about, Elliot, and we talked about at the Conservative conference on various panels as well, it's the triple lock, right?
Yeah, and the triple lock is just the perfect symbol of the degree to which a political party is serious about actually reducing spending and actually sorting out the public finances. You could add to the triple lock the state pension age as well. And until you have a political party that is actually going to address the ballooning cost of our state pension system, as well as, of course, in work, health and disability related benefits, I do question ultimately the seriousness of that party's commitment to restoring the public finances to something equating to an even footing.
Can I just take you to task a little bit on this? So I'm playing devil's advocate here,
please.
Right? But oftentimes I've noticed, not just the TPA, those of a kind of market-orientated, lower tax mindset, fixate on the triple lock. Is it really the biggest item? It seems, are you suggesting that the state pension shouldn't even be index linked?
No, I think it should certainly be linked to inflation.
Okay, right.
I think absolutely linked to inflation.
Right, so
and I think over the last 15 years, if it was linked to inflation, I think there's at least 5 or 6, if not more, years where it would have been inflation linked rather than
I get that.
2.5%.
So what do you think the saving would be? Let's put aside the raising the pension age at the moment, because obviously if you raise the pension age to 87 or something, you'll save a fortune. But putting aside the pension age, what do you think the saving is of it if you moved to it being index linked rather than triple locked? Because generally speaking, it's anomalous that you would get. What is it? It's 2.5% inflation or wage growth, whichever's the highest.
Inflation, yeah, that's right.
Generally speaking, those numbers tend to cluster around. You've got some weird things during COVID that you sort of get, high inflation, zero wage growth, or suddenly afterwards massive wage growth, limited inflation. But putting aside that peculiarity, where I think they did actually make 1 or 2 exceptions to it, I'm not sure that index linking the state pension rather than triple locking it makes any real headway at all. It's a saving I'd like to bank.
Yeah,
but
I think
I'm
from
much
memory,
more I think you've got to be thinking in terms of how we're going to save 150 billion a year.
Yeah, well, listen, I personally quite like the Australian model, which is to not have inheritance tax, i.e. the state does not tax your estate when you die, but at the same time, you don't get access to a state pension unless you are either destitute or extremely disabled. So my 96-year-old grandfather, I think he is now, has only just got access to a state pension in Australia for the first time in the last 18 months, and that is because he is now legally blind.
Well, I would buy that if you
cannot walk.
I buy into it. If you abolish the state pension, you will make serious savings. But the untriple locking it makes, I think, very modest savings. Well, worth banking.
Well, I suppose my point on the seriousness of a political party is if you're not even willing to make modest savings on the state pension, then to what extent are you serious on any other area of public spending? Yeah. Because if you're not even willing to make modest savings, I think the degree to which you're going to be radical in the areas that you need to be radical, including, of course, the state pension.
But do you not think that Reform UK might alight upon a policy agenda? I'm guessing this, I'm speculating, but it seems to be the direction of travel. in which there are a number of relatively modest sort of baubles of a few billion here and a few billion there. And as Ronnie Reagan said, when you're talking about a billion here and a billion there, before you know it, you're talking about real money. But could be offset by potentially gigantic savings. I haven't done the numbers or run the maths, but you sort of say, I've actually got a plan to save 100 billion quid per annum from the welfare bill, because here are a whole list of cohorts who will simply no longer qualify. But I'm going to use 8 billion of that, whatever it might be, in order to lift the child benefit cap or keep the triple lock pension going, or have slightly more generous handouts here, there, or everywhere. But my overall net saving is still massive, 92 billion. I've made up the numbers.
Yeah,
but you get the concept that you make 2 or 3 huge moves. I mean, I would have thought public sector pensions.
I mean, I would love to see an end to the defined benefits scheme. That would be significant.
But do you even take a haircut on the present pension pot? Right. So I wonder whether the way of looking at it should be more radical than even the TPA might be suggesting. That you go and try and find, again, I'm slightly making up the numbers, but ballpark, 200, 300, 350 billion pounds a year in savings of public expenditure by doing 2, 3, 4 or 5 massive things.
Yeah, listen, on public sector
and then
pensions,
you can sort of, you and I, I'm sure, would both agree we should abolish the Arts Council.
Yeah.
But it's a rounding
you're
error,
talking about
right?
billion
So
quid,
I wonder whether actually it's a question of finding 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sort of massive things and not sweating the small stuff quite so much on whether the state pension is triple locked rather than
you like
index
to
linked.
think that Reform would be prepared to do that, but I think Reform, their Achilles heel at the moment is they've got so far by trying to be all things to all people. And if you were going to be that radical, I think there would be a concern that you would lose that red wall vote. So, I mean, politically, from a positive perspective, there's someone who could probably sell it to the electorate. Probably is Nigel Farage, because he's a good communicator. But whether or not it would be a step too far.
They have got the benefit, or what I hope is the benefit, of knowing that they're going to have one crack at the whip of this. The public are going to expect things to be dramatically and drastically different. And if you're able to slash a welfare bill in half because, for example, mental health conditions are no longer eligible for any level of support and a couple of other absolutely huge savings. The things that you can then do with that money are so enormous, you could make things feel very different very quickly. And there would be some losers from that. Of course, there would be some losers from that, but there would also be a significant number of winners from that. And all you need to win another general election is to make sort of 35% of the country feel, oh, this has actually got a lot better. Yes, I'm aware that things are worse for asylum seekers, things are worse for people with mental health conditions, things are worse for people with public sector pensions. But actually, for me, my income tax level has gone down. I didn't have to pay stamp duty when I bought a home. I'm not arranging my tax affairs for inheritance tax. And also, there's significant economic growth that means my salary goes up, et cetera, et cetera. You do something on alcohol duty.
But
but they need to be radical, and they should know that they've only got one chance at it.
But on the basis of Duncan's hypothesis, I'm going to downgrade my happiness level even further to now merely a 5 out of 10, right?
Blimey.
Because
all in the space of the last 23 minutes.
Yeah, quite. Yeah. It's usually so uplifting to be here with the Taxpayers on. Here's the problem, right? And I don't think there's a sleight of hand that can get you around this. If the British electorate aren't up for this, it ain't going to happen.
Yeah,
we're on the road to hell.
Entirely right.
So if it's not quite what you implied, Duncan, it's more what I'm inferring. If we've got a scenario in which the British electorate at a general election are not willing to countenance electing a government that makes any meaningful reduction in tax and spending, well, we're doomed. I mean, we'll go the same way as Argentina or Venezuela. I don't mean the present Argentina, but we're doomed. We will continue to live beyond our means until we can't. So,
but have we not created that problem with successive governments? I mean, I take the view increasingly, I know I'm no economic brain, but I do wonder whether or not the vast chunk of the electorate is economically illiterate. They just simply don't understand. I mean, I grew up in an environment which you don't spend money that you don't have. It really is that simple. Yep. And we've moved so far away from that. But actually, in some cases, previous governments have actually encouraged it in many ways. So actually, have we gone so far down the road, it's almost impossible to persuade people to say, look, this is the reality that we're facing, and this is the pain we need to go through?
No, I think it is possible. I'm not taking it for granted, but I think it is possible. I think most people now realise the economy is stuffed, right? It's performing extraordinarily badly. You guys would keep across the opinion polls more than I do on these particular topics, but haven't we now reached an inflection point where in opinion polls there's now more support for lower taxes than there is for higher spending? But this is quite a shift in the last 3, 4, 5 years. So on a whole range of issues, not just on economic policy, I think the public are well ahead of the political elite and the people who hang out in this London SW1 postcode, with the exception of yourselves and a few other enlightened think tanks, on the fact that the scale of the surgery required in the United Kingdom is immense, right? The bubble of the Westminster Village, by and large, Taxpayers Alliance and some other groups aside, are trying to keep the myth going. A bit like sort of the last days of the Warsaw Pact, where socialists felt they could keep
that, but
going.
we're never going to make any serious headway, at least I don't think so, whilst we have, for example, a Labour government who will just play the card with reform, which is don't vote for them because they want to scrap the NHS. I mean, that's what we're looking at, isn't it?
But that hasn't had any noticeable impact.
No, but it plants a seed, doesn't it, I think, which is if you want to go down the route, we've got to save money. Oh, we can't do that because the NHS might disappear.
Yeah, I mean, there is also some more concerning polling when you get into the granularity of where the public think we're spending too much. So, the percentage that say we spend too much on foreign aid is something like 60, 70, 80%. I mean, it's, really very high. And maybe we do spend too much on foreign aid, but foreign aid budget is now,
tiny.
We are talking about relatively close to a rounding error, whereas I think only 33% said that, despite all the recent media coverage, only 33% say that we're spending too much on the welfare state, specifically the benefits, i.e. not pensions. Pensions is down at like 5% say we spend too much. About 1 in 3 say we spend too much on benefits. So even though the public is getting there on the broad principle that the government spends too much and does too much, unfortunately, they're still not quite there when you start to get into the details. So, just to be clear, this is what we mean by spending
I wasn't
too much.
suggesting it's a slam dunk for any political party.
Yeah,
I'm just saying
it's not.
that the terrain is not obviously completely hostile.
No.
The terrain seems to be that the public seem, to my mind, more open-minded to the possibility of radical change in a wide range of areas than the political establishment have yet contemplated.
Yeah, we're climbing Everest, but at least it's in summer or something.
Yeah.
We spent quite a bit of time, we've referred to Reform UK. I just want to get your views, Mark, in a little bit more detail regarding the current state of the Conservative Party, and then at the moment the rise of the Greens in some of the polls, and then we'll get into popular conservatism. Do you rate Kemi Badenoch?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I haven't kept this private at all. I voted for Robert Jenrick in the leadership election, but she was pretty emphatically my number 2 choice. I think her instincts are all in the right place. In government, she was one of a relatively small number of cabinet ministers who I thought one could count on to attempt to do the right thing, even if she didn't pull it off. I think she could have been a bit braver, going back to our earlier discussion on deregulation around Brexit, for example. But you nevertheless felt her instincts were in the right place. And I continue to think that. She hasn't come out or said anything in which I thought, oh my God, that's a load of left-wing establishment claptrap, right? In fact, most things she comes out and says, I'm like, that looks like a move in the right direction. I suppose my criticism of her would be, I don't think it's bold enough and brave enough. And I don't think that she has managed to articulate a compelling analysis about what went wrong over 14 years of Conservative government. So it's all sort of mistakes have been made, we're now under new management. Okay. But if you were running a restaurant that had managed to give vast numbers of its clientele food poisoning over a 14-year period, I think just putting up a sign saying mistakes were made, we've now got new management, is not going to be sufficient to get the punters flooding back in. So the Conservatives under her watch, at least until now, have not managed to reinvent themselves in the way they did with Keith Joseph and Margaret Thatcher in the 70s, where there was a completely clean break, both from philosophically, from the latter Ted Heath approach, but also in terms of personality. Ted Heath was wandering around in a sulk all the time.
Yeah.
And that hasn't happened. And I think unless that can be grasped, the Conservatives are stuck, because they will be talking into a void, and people will say, well, why should I ever listen to you again? And until you can answer that first question, you're not going to get a hearing on your policy proposals.
You make the same point that last week's guest did, which was Henry Hill, Deputy Editor of Conservative Home, who said, for 14 years, effectively, the Conservative Party talked right but governed left. And they're not explained why or how they did that, or have maybe fully articulated that they understand why people were frustrated with them as a result of that. Do you think she'll survive as leader for the next 12 months?
Probably not, is my honest answer. Because not necessarily because she's done anything catastrophically wrong, but I love analogies with football.
Go on.
And it's like a football manager's job. I mean, if the scores are not on the boards and the points are not coming in, even if you've inherited an incredibly weak and broken team where nobody in the dressing room gets on with each other, you'll carry the can for it.
Yeah.
Now, exactly when that point arrives, just like in football, is not a perfectly predictable algorithm. Exactly when a manager is fired, lots of people are astonished that Amaran's still managing Manchester United. But I guess by beating Liverpool at Anfield the other day, he kind of pulled off the metaphorical equivalent of a spectacular parliamentary by-election win. I suppose that counts. So
Paul Bristow winning the Cambridge and Peterborough.
Or indeed Kemi's very powerful speech at the end of the Conservative conference, right? But at some point, the Conservative Party will panic if the scores don't improve. And the usual way that panic is funneled is you topple the leader. The Conservative Party, since the Brexit referendum, has gone through leaders at a more rapid rate than the average Premier League football club goes through football managers, and that's known to be a very trigger-happy environment. But, she might. I mean, I think the problem at the moment is, unless she can answer that essay question that I set, that there's a completely clean break. So not sort of nudging away from carbon net zero policy, not sort of, we've worked out, we think we can probably leave the ECHR. We have actually, on a spreadsheet, worked out that we can get the civil service back to where it was 8 years ago. All like the direction of travel, don't like the speed of travel. It's got to be a hell of a lot bolder than that. Or a black swan event comes to her rescue. Oftentimes in politics, I suppose it's called holding your nerve, but you sort of sit around, you are the incumbent, you are in position, and if events that you are not in control of could well conspire in your favour. I mean, one example I've heard, not that I would wish this on the country, but it seems to me an eminently plausible theory, I'm not saying it's true, but it could be, that if there is some kind of economic cataclysm, equivalent of the sort of banking crash of 2008, I don't know, a massive run on sterling or something, then you might imagine that might benefit the Conservative Party more than other parties. You might imagine that the reaction of a good chunk of the electorate would be, oh my God, we've got to put back in charge the people who we know can basically add up, even if we don't like them very much. Now, I'm not wishing that to happen. I'm not saying it will happen, and I'm not saying that would be the electoral consequence if it did happen, but it could. Yeah. So, it's something, Keir Starmer basically is Prime Minister, not because of anything he did, but because of external events conspired in his favour. The Conservatives completely blew themselves up. He was able to cling on at a wobbly time in his leadership where it looked like he might be ousted by Angela Rayner. I don't think that, he ran a particularly brilliant election campaign. I don't think he particularly improved his levels of charisma or speaking skills. I don't think that he worked out some great policy agenda, but events conspired in such a way that when the music stopped, he was holding the keys to number 10. That could happen for Kemi. But I would say I am a betting man, and basically I think the betting markets are a pretty good indication as to likely outcomes. If they weren't, they wouldn't be the betting markets, would they? So if you disagree with them, it's bet the other way. And they put Kemi as, somewhat odds against to make it. So that's probably the truth, isn't it?
It is. Right, a couple of lines quickly on the Green Party, then we'll get into some popular conservatism chat. Elliot, the Greens are doing well in the polls at the moment. Zach Palensky's their new leader. Only a few weeks into the gig. They appear to be recruiting a record number of members under his leadership compared to other leaders. Flash in the pan, or was the Greens, are they here to stay?
I don't think they're a flash in the pan. I think it goes back to what we were talking about with regards to the electorate and convincing the electorate that there is essentially a policy agenda that's necessary for the country that's going to be deeply unpleasant for quite a significant number of people, particularly people working in the public sector, particularly people on benefits, and that the only way to really restore the country's fortunes is to deliver that policy agenda that does impact on those people. But that does mean that there is probably 15-20% of the electorate that really just want to be told that there's a nice, easy, cuddly solution that will just solve all the country's problems, that won't require any pain on their behalf or their family's behalf or anyone they know. It's all just ultimately about the super, super, super duper rich and the problems of high net worth individuals and the problems of private equity and capital and all the rest of it. And I think that Zach Polanski, better than probably any left-wing politician I've seen in my lifetime, wraps that nice, warm, cozy, cuddly comfort blanket around that part of the electorate that really just wants to be told everything will be fine. We just need to tax the rich. We do that and we will, we'll be heading to Valhalla. And he's exceptionally good at it. And that means that while I think there is a ceiling to his vote and to the Green Party's vote, in a way that actually if the Green Party just went for a more environmental focused approach, there probably wouldn't be quite as low a ceiling, but they may not ever reach that ceiling. No. I think the Green Party will very rapidly reach 15, maybe even 20% of the polls, albeit because they are fundamentally an unserious party, they won't go above that.
What do you reckon, Mark?
Yeah, I would have thought that the Green Party's ceiling is there or thereabouts, their absolute ceiling. Again, going back to what I just said about luck in politics, I mean, Zach Polanski has rocked up. Obviously, barely a known quantity just 6 or 8 months ago.
Yeah,
now probably still not a household name, right?
No, but we know a bit about him. Former Lib Dem. We also know that he believed he could hypnotise.
You have that in common, Mark.
Women.
Exactly. Hypnotise women to having larger breasts.
I don't make a claim that I've got that power, I have to say, unfortunately. But he's also had the benefit that the Corbyn Sultana party has been a complete catastrophe. Yeah. I mean, again, imagine a parallel universe in which they'd got their act together. Yeah. The Green Party might. So I suspect a good boost in the membership has been that. And the Labour Party, the Labour government is a complete shambles. So that's basically a perfect storm for him, right? That his most obvious competitor party has not got off the ground and looks like it can't even properly run its own website and bank account. And they all hate each other. And the Labour Party is disappointing anybody of a left-wing disposition in government. Kind of be a bit of a miracle if they weren't at 15% or so of the vote. But the other thing, I mean, obviously I disagree with probably everything Zach Polanski says. I was going to say virtually everything. It must be the whole enchilada, right? But the mainstream parties or the legacy parties or whatever you want to call them, populism is the new way of doing politics, right? You need to shoot from the hip, tell it as it is, don't mind your P's and Q's, don't dot every last I and cross every last T. You need to sit down and say, look, this is my view of the world. And Polanski does that, and Farage does that, and Starmer and Kemi and Ed Davey don't really. And I think an awful lot of politicians who've been around the block for the last 10, 15, 20 years or were brought up on politics prior to that, even if they weren't MPs themselves, have got this very old analogue way of communicating and staying on message and not saying boo to a goose. And people are sick and tired of that. So none of this means that Nigel Farage will be Prime Minister and Zach Polanski will be leader of the opposition. But I think their style of communicating, whether you're on the left or the right or the middle or, God knows where on the political spectrum, that is now the route to success. And if you can't master that, you aren't going to get very far.
No question about it. The landscape has changed. How you do politics now has changed. And I still think if you want to call them legacy parties, still have a lot to learn. Let's talk about Popular Conservatism, set up last year, February 2024. How's it going?
Well, I'm pretty pleased because the worse things get for the country, the better they get for my organisation. I took the same view when I was at the IEA, that they were basically inversely correlated. Basically, the worse things got for the economy, the better things got for the IEA. So I'm saddened by a way, because I want to put popular conservatism out of business quickly, right? I don't see it as an institution that will. I know the TPA's just celebrated its 20th anniversary. I would consider it a complete failure if popular conservatism gets anywhere near its 20th anniversary. So it's supposed to be. It is an institution. We've got about 15,000 registered supporters, probably a third or so in Reform, maybe a bit higher than that now, and 2/3 in the Conservative Party, maybe a bit lower than that now. And we've got a hypothesis, basically. And I'd be interested to know what you guys at the TPA think about it. And it was born of my reflections on best part of a decade and a half at the IEA, and looking at our fellow travellers like the Taxpayers Alliance, on sort of why was it that a lot of articulate people with very well-researched policies had for a long period of time been going around arguing for spending constraint, deregulation, lower taxes, better incentives, that kind of thing. And we have made virtually no progress. And weirdly, had made virtually no progress under a Conservative government. My period at the IEA almost totally overlaps with the period the Conservatives were in office. So you would have thought we're kicking the ball downhill in that scenario, right? It's not just, well, we have 14 years of a socialist government. What progress could we make? And my answer to that, and I said it was not something that just sort of came to me late at night or in the shower one morning. I asked a lot of people about it, and this is why I'm really interested. I'd be interested to know what the TPA think about it. Is all the sort of things that the TPA campaign for, or the IEA agitates for, or other groups that you might say are on the kind of free market centre right. There's a danger that we are wandering around in the valley of death, pointing at the ground and saying how terribly infertile the ground is, and occasionally spitting on it in the hope that that might then help to harvest some crops. And we've got all the right arguments. We know how we would grow these crops. We know what a bountiful harvest would look like. And we know that if the ground is not fertile, we're not going to get these bountiful crops. But the problem is upstream, right? The problem, we're not going to get that bountiful harvest by spitting on the ground. The problem is, if we are in the valley of death, the water that's supposed to be flowing down the mountain has been blocked by our enemies. Our problem is, if you like, constitutional and institutional, not just about economic policy, which is downstream of it. And until we can change the governmental structure of Britain, which often sounds very nebulous and abstract, kind of really, who sort of cares about how we configure a department or what the civil service code is, all those sort of things. But I've reached the conclusion that unless you do that, we will continue to wander around in the valley of death, spitting at the ground and complaining about the fact that yet again there hasn't been a very good crop yield this year. So what you've got to do is to actually take on the quangocracy and the regulators, who should be almost completely abolished. The TPA's done brilliant work on quangos. I was very annoyed you didn't come up with the Liz Truss number of 444. I think yours is 430 something. 444 is a lot easier to remember.
Yeah.
And obviously the number fluctuates a bit. All of these have got to be unravelled. Their functions either abolished, in some cases possibly privatised. It might be they can stand on their own 2 feet. Probably in most cases brought within ministerial control. Without, I was going to say without exception. I mean, I think you can get into interesting arguments about whether the Bank of England retains some sort of degree of independence, but I don't think it should be anything like as much independence as it has at the moment. But the Environment Agency, boom, that whole lot goes straight into the Environment Department. The Census and Guidance Council, that goes straight into the Ministry of Justice. Civil servants need to have much clearer codes of conduct so they cannot frustrate government policy. I would probably get rid of the Norfolk Trevelyan settlement, which gives us the presumption that civil servants are neutral. I'd probably now actually move to a politicised civil service, at least at the higher echelons. Doesn't matter whether Janet in accounts is left-wing or right-wing, but if you're involved in policy, probably the top 3,000 roles, and then you get rid of SPADs, right? You get rid of special advisors, you merge those together, and you have policy roles. You extract yourself from a whole range of international treaties. You bring back the law lords, get rid of the Supreme Court, put judicial appointments again within political control so that you don't get these absurd rulings by judges. And indeed, virtually every decision made by a government now seems to be subject to legal challenge. This is absolutely unbelievable. You can argue about whether you think Palestine action should be prescribed or not. I think an interesting argument can be had about that. But it's got to be a decision of Parliament. It cannot be a decision of the courts. You can argue about whether or not we should send those that we cannot deport back to their own countries to Rwanda or not. But the idea that Parliament doesn't take that decision, it's the courts. And I think until you reset all of that, right, you won't get the downstream effects that we're all yearning for. So we can argue till we're blue in the teeth about how this tax rise is on the wrong side of the Laffer curve, or this spending is inefficient, but we will still be in the valley of death, spitting on the ground, complaining that we can't get a decent crop yield. So I want that complete reset. And my mission, which I hope is a relatively short-term one, is to persuade people on the centre-right that that is actually the overarching priority, that it does not give you any guarantee of a low tax, light regulation, lower spending outcome, but it gives you the possibility of it. Yeah. And if you don't fix that and let the water flow downstream, if you don't fix the bureaucracy, if you don't make the constitutional changes, then your chances of bringing it about are near zero. And that's also my explanation as to why the Conservative government failed. It was not that they were all a bunch of socialists, a handful of them were. It was that they came up against a system that is so geared to socialism that any efforts to deregulate or cut taxes are efforts in pushing water uphill. And you might get one or two successes there. But generally speaking, you're not going to get much success. It'd be a bit like, a bleaker country at a bleaker period, but sort of being a free market reformer in the German Democratic Republic. And sort of say, well, probably it would be good if we had the sort of price mechanism working a bit more in agriculture. Well, yeah, fine, but for as long as you've got an agricultural price setting committee that is setting the price of bread, you ain't going to get it. Yeah. So, I'm not saying we're as bad as East Germany was in the 1970s, but it's a similar concept that you need that system change. And if you don't get that system change, my fear is that our political victories for those that want a smaller state and lower taxes will be very thin on the ground, whatever the technical political complexion of the government.
Well, I'll just say you've just served up several courses of very rare red meat to our podcast listeners, but I'll let Elliot respond regarding from a TPA perspective.
Yeah, there's a few. I essentially agree with all of that. Obviously, the very difficult thing that any politician and any government party, that particularly right-wing party, has coming into office is that essentially what we're talking about here is you have to spend the first few years irrigating the valley of death before anything's actually going to start growing. And by the time things start growing, you may have another election on your plate. And at the same time, the reason why the public don't seem to be alive to the urgency quite as much as they should be is to use the analogy of WALL-E. So have both of you seen the film WALL-E, the Disney Pixar film? I have
not seen it.
So Earth is essentially becomes an urban wasteland. Nothing grows anymore, and so they build this big spaceship, and everyone goes into space, and they have this slothful existence.
That's got to be a second-term commitment.
Well, yeah. But essentially, and the idea is they're only on this spaceship until plants start growing again. Yeah. But they stop bothering to check if plants are growing on Earth because everyone's sat on this spaceship and everything's served to them, and they're all sat on these sort of like moving wheelchairs, and everyone becomes very obese and slothful. And maybe that spaceship is headed towards a black hole at some point, but we don't know exactly when it's going to happen, and it'll be sometime in the future, so we sort of don't need to worry. So yes, I think the valley of death analogy is appropriate, but at the moment, a lot of the public are on this spaceship that actually is quite a comfortable spaceship to be on. It may not be a comfortable spaceship to be on for much longer, but they can sort of delude themselves. And then, in terms of the amount of time some of this stuff will take, you only have to look at the last great example of what you're talking about, i.e. rewiring the state in the hope that it can ultimately deliver free market outcomes, which was Brexit. But that took decades in order to build up the public case. Now, that was done out of government rather than in government. And obviously in government, you have a lot more power. But it does speak to the problem that at the moment, the issue that you have with any Conservative party is Conservative politicians tend to, by instinct, be loath to radicalism. Even if, Rishi Sunak is a great example of this. I don't think there's anybody that knows Rishi Sunak that doesn't say that actually if you quiz him on his economic and political principles, they are generally pretty free market, pretty right-leaning. However, he was also clearly a man that was very, very against radicalism, very against rocking the boat, and so was far, far more inclined to generally technocratic, measured, careful improvements. And how you build a Conservative Party and a set of Conservative MPs that are willing to come in and genuinely focus on completely and radically rewiring the state. And that means, in some cases, dismantling or fundamentally changing some very deeply, I wouldn't say quite loved anymore, but sort of maybe cherished institutions because of their historical role.
Which do you think are cherished?
Well, I think things like, I think universities is a really obvious one, right? Like, most Conservative politicians may have had really good experiences at Oxford or Cambridge or other top leading universities. And really, even if they intellectually get that many of these universities have been taken over by a radical left-wing establishment and HR and bureaucracy and administration and all the rest of it, it's quite a step to sort of believe that intellectually and then get into government and actually take, really radical decisions that could destroy those universities if those universities
but I think,
don't
Elliot,
end
what
up.
you've done is you've sketched out why I might not succeed.
Yeah,
not
absolutely.
why I'm wrong.
I certainly agree with everything you said. I'm just explaining the serious
I would
difficulties.
sort of roughly agree with that. That we were sort of saying earlier on some policy areas that Conservatives favour keyhole surgery over open heart surgery,
absolutely.
even if
And
open heart
that's not what's
surgery is needed.
Yeah.
This is why I think reform are quite interesting. That you sort of get the sense that reform seem to be aware that the patient needs massive surgery.
Yeah. Quadruple
there might be a
bypass at this
danger
point.
that they sort of approach it by using a chainsaw rather than a scalpel. But somehow,
Forget the anti.
Somehow on the centre right, this needs to sort of come together. Both the diagnosis and the surgery need to be got right. And maybe it won't succeed. I mean, but I think it's edging in that direction.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that the Conservative Party are in favour now of leaving ECHR, that's quite a shit. And by the time they reach that conclusion,
and abandoning net zero as well.
And abandoning net zero. By the time they reach these conclusions, these were unsurprising conclusions.
Yeah.
Now, none of that means there's nailed on success. If it was nailed on success, I'd wind up popular conservatism now. The question is this the principal task facing the centre right? And I think it is. And there's 1,000,001 reasons why one might be unsuccessful in executing that task or persuading people of the veracity of it or the importance of it or the salience of it. But that's what I'm attempting to do. That's what I think. That's the mission of this group.
Well, we need to knock this one on the head. I think we'll get you in a few months' time in that part 2. I think. Mark Littlewood, thank you. People listening to A Nation of Taxpayers, they want to find out more about PopCons. What do they need to do?
Go to popularconservatism.com. You'll find our website there. We're also on Twitter. You can find me on Twitter or X. I'm at Mark J. Littlewood.
Lovely. Elliot Keck, thank you. Mark, thank you. And thank you again for listening. Just a reminder, you find us on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, and also on YouTube. Please share, subscribe, rate and review, and help spread the word. And if you want to make a contact or send an email, maybe suggest a future guest for a future episode, the email address is podcast@taxpayersalliance.com. Thank you.